Thank you very much. Thank you for you here in the room, and welcome to those who are watching live stream. This is the panel on the environment and health impact of military bases, the plenary. And I'd just like to say, I think it's so important that we're adding health here to a discussion of environment, because it's often implicitly sort of hanging out there in the open environment as we talk about environmental impacts. But it's very important to be very explicit now about the health impacts, I believe, so that we can bring in the health professionals, the public health professionals, the medical doctors, and the scientists as part of expanding and diversifying the peace movement, so that we bring these people in to support us in building a wider network within the United States and elsewhere as we try to broaden and build solidarity to close bases. Bases are not just a point, as we know, of launching military operations, but they're a point of extraordinarily complex impacts on base personnel, military personnel, military and civilian personnel on base, and those living in the communities around the bases. So that we need to talk about these impacts as well, about base, the consequences of bases, both in this country and in other countries, in foreign countries, so that we can build solidarity between populations and between those affected and between those who care. I think it's very important to talk about what we're for and to revive the notion of the human right to health, to really use the United Nations instruments of human rights and demand our human right to health, and also to recognize that nature has rights, so that we really begin to look at the ecological impacts here, so that if we don't have a thriving and surviving ecology, if we don't recognize the rights of nature, then we as people on this planet cannot survive and thrive either. So just one other aspect. What is the theft? We were challenged to think about the theft from the extraordinary military budget of what we could do here at home and what countries could do abroad. And the theft really is of our health and of thriving economic systems. So that we need to think, I think we can bring back into this discussion of health the environmental movement to think much more about not just the environment as nature, but the ecology as an environment in which we need to be able to live a fulfilled, healthy life. So I'd like to introduce my panelists. We're going to start out with Pat Elder, and then be followed by Marie Cruz Soto, Patricia Hines, and Susan Schnall. I urge you to look at their biographies in the conference program. They're extremely accomplished individuals who I'm very glad to welcome to this panel, and I've had such a great experience working with them to put this together, so thank you very much. Pat, would you like to?
Sure. Thank you. In the fall, David Swanson and I wrote How War Pollutes the Potomac River, an article published to coincide with World Beyond War's No War 2017 War in the Environment Conference in Washington in September. The article briefly describes 6 deadly EPA Superfund sites on military bases near Washington. AV man, what are we doing? Thank you. ProPublica developed the search tool for locating environmental contamination caused by the military. They took EPA data and made it user-friendly. Just Google bombs in your backyard. It's worth it. Blow up the screen and identify the sites nearest you and find out about the contaminants in your environment. So, let's take a trip down the Potomac River from the Allegheny Ballistics Laboratory in Rocket Center, West Virginia, to the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Dahlgren, Virginia. The Navy's Allegheny Ballistics Lab manufactures warheads and shells, grenades, mortars. Making weapons of mass destruction causes massive environmental destruction. Contaminated areas include burning grounds, a beryllium landfill. Contaminants in soil and groundwater include explosives, volatile organic compounds, industrial wastes. Contaminants have been detected in the Potomac. The EPA estimates the surface water at Allegheny had trichloroethylene at concentrations of 3.7 million parts per billion. Trichloroethylene in soil migrates into groundwater. Exposure to trichloroethylene is associated with several types of cancers in humans, particularly kidney and liver cancer. Speaking of cancer, the Kristen Renee Foundation has identified 2,717 cancer victims within 3 miles of Fort Detrick, Maryland. They filed a lawsuit in 2016 that the federal government's failure to clean up contaminated soil and groundwater at Fort Detrick caused the illnesses and deaths of their relatives. The case was thrown out. The Army claims sovereign immunity. Where in the hell does that leave you and me? Organizer Randy White in the black jacket lived close to the base. Randy lost his daughter and his wife to cancer. By the way, Area B was a proving ground in the Army's biological warfare program. Fort Detrick dumps high levels of phosphorus into the drain system that washes into the Monocacy River, a tributary of the Potomac. Phosphorus kills life. 40 miles down the river, we come to Washington, D.C.'s Spring Valley neighborhood, where American University is located. This area was used by the Army during World War I to test lewisite, a lethal gas made of arsenic. Soldiers tied animals to stakes and set off chemical weapons to see how quickly the animals died. Soldiers buried remaining stockpiles of munitions. Groundwater is contaminated along the banks of the Potomac and throughout the campus of American University in Spring Valley. In the fall, this is since our conference in Washington in September, 7 workers were hospitalized during the cleanup of a chemical weapons dump found under a house that once stood at 4825 Glenbrook Road. 5 miles further south, the Washington Navy Yard is located on the Anacostia River. The ground adjacent to the river is contaminated with tetrachloride, cyanide, perchloroethylene, carbon tetrachloride, dichloroethylene, vinyl chloride, lead, heavy metals, acids, alkaline, lead, chromium, cadmium, antimony, PCBs, dioxins, and more. Slide 14. 20 miles south, we come to Indian Head Naval Surface Warfare Center with its 100-year history of dumping and burning hazardous wastes. Surface water at the facility is contaminated with high levels of mercury. Groundwater contains perchlorate at concentrations of 436,000 micrograms per liter. To put this data into context, the Maryland Department of Environment establishes a drinking water advisor level of 1 microgram per liter. Perchlorate has been linked to its negative effect on the thyroid. Indian Head open burns hazardous explosives and sprinkles poisonous dust over southern Maryland, where I live. When the Indian Head cleanup team needed to take soil or water samples, they often had to call in ordnance clearance specialists to help deal with dangerous chemicals, guns, rockets, missiles, explosives littering the area. Look at the iron at the bottom of the page. The Naval Surface Warfare Center in Dahlgren, Virginia, is 20 miles south of Indian Head. Dahlgren open burns hot, hazardous waste, sprinkling even more powders of poison over the Potomac, southern Maryland, and Virginia. The burial of munitions at Dahlgren has contaminated the river with heavy metals. Polyaromatic hydrocarbons have poisoned the earth along the mighty Potomac. PCBs, trichloroethylene, and various pesticides mixed with lead contamination from firing ranges and buried depleting uranium. It's bad. Imagine how much worse it is around the world. Imagine conditions in Vieques, the Philippines, South Korea, Okinawa, Vietnam, Iraq, when the heart of the empire is polluted to the degree it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pat. I'd now like to welcome Marie Cruz Soto, who is associated with New York Solidarity with Vieques. She's an assistant professor at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study at New York University. Welcome. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hello. So I'm going to be talking about Puerto Rico, or that archipelago in the Caribbean that was invaded by the U.S. in 1898. And 3 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court. So that archipelago that was invaded in 1898, and that 3 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court deemed it, and I'm quoting, foreign in a domestic sense. In other words, a colony. But more specifically, I'm going to be talking about Vieques, and this is an island. Here is a map. I'm going to be talking about Vieques. So this is an island with approximately 10,000 people who for over 60 years were forced to live wedged between an ammunition depot to the west and a live fire range to the east. So here is a map that you can see. Even though it says 2001, 2003, it was basically the usage from the 1940s. So with the onset of World War II, both the U.S. federal government and the Puerto Rican colonial state approved the expropriation of 3/4 of Vieques to make way for the U.S. Navy. So the local people were forcibly removed from their homes, encouraged to emigrate, to leave the island, and offered to be relocated within Navy-owned plots of land from which they could be expropriated at any given moment. And I have a map there in which you can see that the white part in the middle is the non-Navy-owned land of Vieques, post-1940s. So in occupied Vieques, access to land, water, and air was restricted. And developmental strategies had to be basically approved by the Navy and ultimately for the benefit of the Navy. And while Viequenses experienced occupation differently based on where they lived, their race, their gender, their occupation, many could not actually escape the saturation of the landscape with servicemen. So as you could imagine, there were a lot of street fights, assaults. People tell about prostitution networks ruling the nights in Vieques. They talk about vibrations, noise, murders, accidents, munitions not making it to the target zone, and other kinds of things. So the vulnerability of the Viequense population gained international attention in April 1999. And this is the date when a jet pilot erroneously dropped two bombs off target and killed civilian David Sanes, who was stationed as a civilian security guard within the base. So I want to be clear that this was not the first time that a Viequense died because of the Navy's presence in the island. Yet, the death of David Sanes happened to coincide with certain kinds of things, and I want to list a few things here. First, in 1999, it was the end of the Cold War. And in the colonial Puerto Rican scenario, that meant that there was a kind of democratic opening for dissent to be voiced that could not be possible during the Cold War. So people could actually critique Navy practices in a way that they could not before. There was also, in the late 1990s, the Puerto Rican diaspora had a more empowered or at least more visible presence within the U.S. And in this, I'm thinking, for example, about Congresswomen Nidia Velázquez, Congressmen Jose Serrano and Luis Gutierrez, who all voiced their support for the anti-Navy struggle in Vieques and also were arrested for civil disobedience. Another condition that sort of happened after 1999 in Vieques was that Puerto Rican nationalism was basically delinked from pro-independence stances. And this allowed for different political sectors to basically come together in supporting the struggle in Vieques, or as people call it, la lucha, right? There was also the rise of the internet and mobile phones. And this I cannot emphasize enough because basically people in Vieques, community activists, could coordinate, strategize across space, and they also could expand their community of solidarity, right? They could learn from other struggles in other places and also think about what they were doing. So this ties into the idea of transnational connections. And in this I would also mention that community activists in Vieques, community Viequense leaders as well, traveled to places like Okinawa, South Korea, the Philippines, and other places to basically learn about other people's struggles, and also through that learning, they took it home and then thought about the struggle in Vieques, right? To strategize, to think about, okay, steps ahead, and also to offer their solidarity to these other places that people understood that they were basically living a similar situation. So, thinking even about these leaders, one thing that happened in 1999 with the death of David Sanes is that in 1999 there was already a group of seasoned activists who had a long history of organizing, dating back to the 1960s. Organizing through sanctioned means, but also organizing through civil disobedience. And in this, I would point out to the fishermen in the late 1970s, early 1980s, who did civil disobedience, like it's shown in the pictures here, in the photographs. So These seasoned activists had what I would call a collective repertoire. Things that they had already been thinking about, working upon, and also the knowledge that they had been gaining from coming together, thinking, coming into dialogue with other struggles in other sites, and they were borrowing from this, thinking about this, incorporating, appropriating, and thinking about what to do in terms of 1999 Vieques, right? So perhaps it should be no surprise then that there were civil disobedience camps established along the eastern part of the island in the live fire range, right? And it's no coincidence that, for example, this camp is Mount David after David Sanes. Something else that people did in Vieques was basically thinking that when the arrest came that dismantled the civil disobedience camps in May of 2001, there was already a strategy in place. And basically what community activists and leaders did then was figure out a way to sneak small groups of people into the restricted territory all the time. Try not to get them caught, but try to make sure also that the Navy knew that they were there, right? So that the point of this was that the Navy could not resume the bombing in any sort of comfortable way, to disrupt as much as possible. And there are stories about actually people being in there, letting the Navy know through different means, and the bombing is still happening, right? But all this mobilization was successful in getting the Navy officially out of Vieques, so the Navy was forced, unwillingly left, in May of 2003. And as may be obvious by the theme of the panel, behind remains 60 years worth of basically bombings, right?